Gamescom may not be the largest event for new gaming announcements, but the convention provides valuable hands-on impressions for a decent chunk of upcoming games. Since the publishers attending tend to vary each year, you never know what you'll get, but regardless of who shows up, there are always at least a few standout games.
So without further ado, here are my quick and dirty impressions of what I found to be the standout games, one way or the other, from the dozen or so titles I got my hands on at Gamescom 2024. Capcom has been hitting home run after home run for like the past 6 or 7 years now.
While I'm confident in their future lineup, perhaps their winning streak might not be as clean when it comes to some upcoming games like Dead Rising Remastered and maybe even Monster Hunter Wilds, the one I personally got to play. First, the good parts. The core concept of man versus nature feels even more pronounced than in prior Monster Hunter games. Even though it's easy to get back into the flow of your preferred weapon quickly if you played one of these games long enough, starting a new entry should still make you feel cautious and uncertain, and that's still true for Wilds. The new monsters, especially the bear creature from the trailers, not only look very menacing thanks to a sick art direction, those bear things in particular became even more imposing by attacking in larger packs now. And as it should be, these monsters did not give up easily, and it took at least 10 to 20 minutes to repel them in the demo with 4 players. On top of that, there seems to be an even bigger focus on the forces of your natural surroundings, at least within the desert stage that was playable and which appears quite a bit larger than the maps of Monster Hunter World, because the atmosphere intensified when lightning started to strike the sands or when greasy lizards started to attach themselves to the big bears, which then tried to fend them off. I played the greatsword, which felt pretty much like it did in World. However, I wasn't yet able to fully grasp the new focus feature. You apparently need to hit sore spots on the monster, then attack them while holding the left shoulder button. It was hard to tell when these spots would appear, but I'm not gonna complain about a learning curve in Monster Hunter. Which brings me to one irritation I had with the demo of Wilds, which I hope isn't as prevalent in the final game, and that is the new mount. Conveniently, riding this not chocobo makes it much easier to chase down monsters while managing items. However, the mount was also able to locate the main quest monster right at the beginning of the mission and run there without any player input. You can control the bird, but it will automatically move if you don't press anything. Call me crazy, but I liked the hunting aspect in Monster Hunter. I get it, the oldest series games could be overbearing, making you equip individual maps, breakable tools and paintballs to track the monster. Finding that too cumbersome is fine, because Monster Hunter World found a very nice balance between quality of life and its hunting nature, by making you spot tracks in the environment before leading you to a monster. It was easier and actually gave it more of a hunting feel than in the old games, where you really couldn't tell where the monster was at all. However, the new mount is the kind of hand-holding that might just tilt the balance a little too much. Exploring and monster tracking feels pretty much redundant that way, and it felt more like a sick arena monster fighting game, less like monster hunting. Previews of Dead Rising also suggest that more lenient balancing and assist features break the old game's structure and atmosphere. Capcom in the last generation did a great job keeping the nature of their oldest franchises intact, but fine-tuning them enough for modern gaming habits. Dead Rising could be the first miss, which didn't quite balance these new features right, and this admittedly minor detail in Wilds isn't something I appreciate either. However, I have, of course, only played a single demo, from which it isn't possible to tell how complex the quest objectives actually will be outside of combat. And again, combat itself is more of what has worked in Monster Hunter World, except even more ambitious in its production. I guess I might become a fan of Warhammer now, because even without much knowledge of the tabletop template, the intro of Space Marine was quite promising. Admittedly, it's kind of lazy to only describe a game by putting another one down, but I just can't help but to feel that Space Marine 2 is the more intuitive and more engaging version of Helldivers 2. In Helldivers, I couldn't get into the flow of the gameplay, as the controls and the attack patterns of the enemies didn't feel intuitive enough to me. Space Marine, on the other hand, feels inherently easy to pick up, as it pretty much plays like you'd expect. Whether you're unloading the magazines of your space guns into the lizard hordes or hacking through the masses with your giant saw, the controls are always smooth and responsive, and more importantly, hit feedback feels hefty and rewarding. Speaking of which, there also are brutal finishers like in the Doom reboots if a large enemy is weakened and starts to flash. But don't be mistaken, the systems, at least in the first levels, are not as complex as in something like Doom Eternal. This bullet spree is more about turning off your brain and filling up on dopamine. I guess in its basic nature it is comparable to games like Evil West, except that Warhammer isn't hampered by a small budget. However, I played on the normal difficulty level and there are at least 2 tougher ones. If these are well balanced, there shouldn't be a problem here either, giving this edgy slaughter enough of a strategic edge. One drawback could be that the spectacle seemed like it was cheating a bit, at least in the beginning, because although there are dozens of aliens to destroy on the screen, by far the largest hordes were often in the background. At the same time, large arsenal such as missile fire could not be controlled by the players, so it remains to be seen whether the campaign can realize the mass battles hinted at in the trailers without compromise. For many years, spectacular looking new action game IPs kept being announced from mainland Asia, from previously unknown developers or mobile game divisions, but they often disappeared forever, which made me doubt that any of them would ever come out. Now that games such as Wukong and Stellar Blade actually did release and even looked like what they promised, my worldview has admittedly been thrown for a loop. Phantom Blade Zero was another one of those Asian games whose trailers looked suspiciously like vaporware, or at least like it was deceiving in its presentation. Once again shocked, I played a very solid build of the title at Gamescom that really looked like it was promoted. Well, maybe not entirely. I got the impression that this was more of a traditional action game, but no, actually it's yet another Chinese game heavily inspired by From Software. But to be fair, it does seem to have its own identity, and if I had the opportunity, I would have continued playing. It's more of a mixture of various inspirations. The action is reminiscent of titles such as Devil May Cry, where the focus is on combos of light and strong attacks, and Souls elements are comparable to titles such as Nioh or Sekiro. So the aim is to drain the stamina of individually targeted opponents in one-to-one duels and either evade or counter their attacks in time. There are 2 types of counterattack in Phantom Blade. Strong attacks with a blue marking must be blocked in time with a weapon, while red attacks must be evaded. In both cases you'll get a big advantage. A temporary special attack is activated with the shoulder button, with which the protagonist falls into a kind of sword dance, which resembles some of the fast-paced attacks in the trailers. Considering the sheer number of Souls clones, this doesn't sound particularly earth-shattering. However, Phantom Blade also seems to do little wrong. The controls are easy to master for genre veterans, and the difficulty level feels challenging but not frustrating. The biggest challenge has been to react correctly to the 2 colors when dodging strong attacks. The big boss of the demo had one-hit KO attacks, which felt slightly janky, but overall I only died 4 times in the relatively large demo. By the way, so far Phantom Blade Zero didn't seem like a boss rush game like Wukong, but to feature at least dedicated levels. Also, the game stands out with its relatively underused setting. The gloomy mountain backdrop inspired by Chinese legends was very pleasing to look at, and I found the edgy main character and horror-themed stages more appealing than Wukong. It was a little shocking to go back to the original version of Sonic Generations while preparing for the enhanced remaster. I still remember the first time I played it because after Resident Evil 5 it was easily the most impressive looking game I had seen on PS3 and Xbox 360 up until that point, and arguably the graphics still look stronger than in certain Sonic games which released a decade later. Thanks to a strong art direction attuned to the impressive lighting of the so-called Hedgehog engine, it almost felt like playing an animated movie, at least in certain stages like the Green Hill Zone. On top of that, that, it was the first 3D Sonic game that didn't rely on unnecessary gameplay gimmicks, but focused on decent enough 3D parkours and nicely paced side-scrolling. However, looking back, the original version really pushed its hardware to the limits, with some pretty bad stuttering, laughably long loading times, and more importantly, the controls didn't feel quite responsive enough for the high speed of the gameplay. In particular, the side-scrolling wasn't as snappy as in Sonic Mania or Sonic Superstars, which made Sonic Generations an actual good title to pick for a traditional remaster, to clean up those performance issues while keeping the already solid core game intact. And that's exactly what Sonic X Shadow Generations seems to do. The Sonic levels look pretty much the same, but they feel much smoother to control thanks to improved performance. Particularly the 3D sections are still a little floaty at times, but this is due to the nature of the intended gameplay style. Speaking of which, the new stages for Shadow feel pretty much in line with the rest of the game. With Sonic's edgy counterpart, you also race through linear highway style courses and memorize where to perform homing attacks or small QTEs to reach the best stage ranking. However, Shadow has been given the special maneuver Chaos Control, which can be used to freeze time in the level, for example when there are too many enemies on the screen. The controls for boosting are also minimally different, and Shadow gets a teleport attack instead of a homing attack. Not exactly world changing, but the two mascots at least don't feel like a simple skin swap during gameplay. The only thing that was a little jarring was that the boost has been moved to the right shoulder button. But during those short highway-esque boosting sections, you're still using the shoulder buttons to dash left and right, which means that you cannot boost and dash simultaneously anymore. I don't know whether in the final game you'll be able to assign buttons, and it's possible that the rest of the game wasn't remastered so smoothly, especially because there's a history of bad Sonic ports. But so far there wasn't anything that would suggest that. Apart from that, Shadow is obviously all about that Sonic Adventure 2 nostalgia, since the Generation games always recreate set pieces from old games, and I'm not gonna lie, I very much enjoyed seeing some of those old enemies and levels return. The edgy attitude of Shadow was unsurprisingly made fun of back in the day, but as an adult I'm ready to embrace all of this ridiculous pseudo badassery. Games shouldn't be taken so seriously all the time. Playing Metaphor, the new fantasy JRPG by Atlus, not long after the Persona 3 remake, felt quite funny. I hadn't even planned to compare the new IP with earlier Persona games, but it's hard to ignore the blatant similarities, at least within the dungeon gameplay that I got to try out. In fact, it was surprising just how much Metaphor felt like its brother in spirit, to the point that it might as well have been a fantasy mod for Persona. Admittedly, my session was too short to fully grasp the battle system or to see how it differs from Persona's press turn system, in which the right elemental spells produce extra moves for the player, nor was I able to see how the game structure outside the dungeons differs from Atlus' high school simulation. But in terms of controls, button assignments and animations, the game feels nearly identical, at least while dungeon crawling. Even the victory screens are extremely similar. In addition, the party members also summon Persona-like spirits that execute attacks with different elements, and they even occupy the same button. The biggest difference for now was the mix of real-time and turn-based combat. Weak enemies can simply be punched away on the map, while stronger enemy health points can be knocked down before entering a turn-based combat menu. Some of the weaker enemies didn't do much though, so it felt on par with slashing through those small pillars in the dungeons of Persona 3. By the way, none of this is meant to be a negative. Personally, I have long become tired of Japan's obsession with high school cringe, which is why I'm actually glad that the tried and tested gameplay principle of Persona has been given a fresh coat of paint with the story backdrop of Metaphor, which really doesn't feel like anything else, with its chaotic art style that mixes the world of traditional fantasy with Attack on Titan and a graffiti-like appearance. Kingdom Come Deliverance was like a dream come true for the LARPing scene. The revenge story about the Squire Henry completely abstains from fantasy elements to portray a much more historically accurate picture of feudal Bohemia, and I actually was very much into that too. Especially since I've grown tired of Dungeons and Dragons inspired fantasy in Western media. The first game was still hampered by a small crowdfunding budget, leading to a lot of bugs at launch and janky combat. Now Kingdom Come 2 very much felt like a polished version of the original concept, which has all the elements that made the original quite engaging underneath the jank. The approach to quests remains very open, with many different routes and possible mechanics to reach a goal. For one, there's your typical Western RPG toolbox of tackling problems either with brute force, perhaps stealth or diplomacy, all potentially leading to different outcomes. And it seems that if you do not follow some rules, like killing someone on a stealth mission to steal a sword, despite your quest giver urging you not to, the quests will apparently be closed forever. On the other hand, to heighten the immersion, you still have to manage factors like hunger, and mechanics are usually attuned to the medieval backdrop, which can be quite amusing. I tried causing chaos like in GTA, for which you can pay a fine afterwards, or put up a solid fight against gods, or volunteer to be chastised publicly, and maybe go confess afterwards. However, combat still doesn't seem to be the game's strongest suit, and when I left the town in the demo without an active quest going on, exploring the overworld felt pretty meaningless, with nothing ever happening. Also personally, I don't really care for Henry's characterization. I would have preferred to play a blank slate to tackle Bohemia. Still, even with that in mind, it's hard to argue that this won't be a very engaging medieval sandbox for any history buff. I admit that as a weeb I don't know much about Western ARPGs, so when I was told things about player agency in Titan Quest 2, about how flexible and unbound your class builds are gonna be, choosing between intelligent or strong mages and archers, and how modifiers would improve complexity and freedom of item inherent buffs, it didn't really mean that much to me. Yet I was also told all the right things to make me excited for the game either way. I always liked the mood of Diablo, but didn't really stick with it. Be it because it was too focused on mouse and keyboard, or randomly generated dungeons, or because it eventually stopped being playable offline. Titan Quest 2 seems to check all the boxes that would excite someone like me though. It's supposed to be fully playable offline, have one complete campaign with a wholly handcrafted map, non-linear exploration, no microtransactions, and controller support is in the works too. On top of that, I'd argue that ancient mythology as a backdrop is severely underused, so there's not much detail that I can give on gameplay details in comparison to something like Path of Exile, but in an era where the Western industry is crushing under the weight of its live service ambitions and nickel and diming its customers, you can count me in for Titan Quest 2 if it truly delivers on its promises.